I'm Kellee Tsai. I'm the Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences. And we're absolutely delighted to have Professor Jean-Pierre Cabestan with us to talk about China in Africa, a new hegemony. Professor Cabestan is a very distinguished scholar of both Chinese politics as well as Taiwanese politics, Sino-African relations. He has published, my goodness, over 20 books, so I won't be able to read them all, and dozens and dozens of articles. He served as the director of the Taipei office of the French Center for Contemporary China, CEFC, in the 90s, and then also served as the director of CEFC right here in Hong Kong from 1998 to 2003, and was with CNRS in Paris for a number of years, and then moved to Hong Kong to join the Department of Government and International Studies at Hong Kong Baptist University back in 2007, where he rose the ranks to become professor and chair professor and now chair professor emeritus. And we are just super honored to have you with us today. Well, Professor Cabestan.
Thank you, Kellee, for this very kind introduction. Well, thank you also to the CFC for having invited me to talk about something I've been working for 12 years now, which is China-Africa relations. Now, as you've seen, I've titled my presentation, which is an overview of China in Africa. China, and I've revised a bit the title that you put in the post, a bit different. Is the final title I've opted for is China in Africa, a New Hegemony. And so it's for people who are knowledgeable of China-Africa relations, maybe it's a kind of a too broad overview, but I've tried to sort of to update you about the state of China-Africa relations that we speak today. So why did I use the term hegemony here? I think it's clear that some of the, I will go through some of the slides rather quickly, but I think China's footprint in Africa is much larger than other emerging economies' footprint, and has become even larger than the established powers' footprint in Africa, the United States, to some degree the European Union, and the former colonizers, but also other Asian countries like Japan. So the term I use is the one that's been also used by Kellee Tsai in a recent publication inspired by Robert Cox, who said that hegemony is a strong structural and economic power, political power, economic and political power, as well as the ability and the will to generate. I would add the will to generate consent and exercise leadership, and that's so. But the Chinese hegemony is based not so much on military and security power, like the US, or even France today in some parts of West Africa, but rather on expanding and highly, and it's called an asymmetrical economic relationship, particularly loan-based, which is structured by loan-based infrastructure projects, as well in parallel political, diplomatic, which is very important, diplomatic, ideological, and cultural in Africa, but not only in Africa. So that has led a number of African countries to reorient their foreign policy and the international priorities. And that's the summary of what I want to demonstrate. People who've worked on the hegemony, I will pass on this one, but rather quickly. I've put forward the idea that China's hegemony is much more a Dutch-like hegemony based on mercantilism than the US type hegemony, and it's clear that China is still promoting a multipolar world, but it's behind that, clearly China is promoting a new form of hegemony, which has led to some kind of bipolarity between the US and China on the global stage. Now, I mentioned here a recent publication by Kellee Tsai about which it's going the concept of hegemonic potential, which is quite interesting. Because China has produced development dynamics that may constrain, and that's quite interesting, China's capacity to assume position of world economic hegemon. Now, in Africa, of course, and we'll see that as an administration, China, as I said, is being very, 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 very strong, but at the same time, you have other players which may mitigate China's influence. in the longer run. So China is far from being the only game in town in Africa. And if you go to Africa for field work, you will see that very clearly. But there's been a lot of debate of China's soft power, and like at the end, it's debatable and contested. And so that's something we'll come back to, I think. All right, now China's Africa relation is part of a new dynamic, which is a new dynamic of South-South relations between Asia and Africa. What I would like to emphasize here is the fact that a lot of Asian countries, but not only Asian countries, a lot of emerging economies have invested in Africa's future, because Africa's population is going to double. It's still a very young continent. I think they may benefit, like India today, of a kind of demographic dividend, which has disappeared from China and other Asian countries today. Now, Africa has other major Asian partners, and here I've just listed very for your information some of the summits that other Asian countries have established more or less around the same time as China. China established the FOCAC in 2000, but Japan was earlier in doing that, but also India later, Turkey, South Korea have been also very active in trying to develop their relationship with the African continent. Now, African footprint, and here I've collected a few very recent data about China's economic footprint in Africa is much bigger than any other country, because China has become maybe not the factory of the world anymore, but still a very important part of the global supply chain. And for that reason, China refined, you can see 60% of the world nickel, that's a part of nickel comes from Africa, 40% of copper, and part of crops from Africa. Where it's more striking is for lithium and cobalt, because cobalt, as you know, a lot of cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. 70% of the world production, and China controls, and that's a big issue with the US today, and also European nation. Final example is bauxite or aluminium, raw material which is produced in many places, but in West Africa. Okay. So that's, and finally, tropical wood is also part of the imports of China from Africa. Now let's go back to the relationship as a whole. I think, first of all, we have to sort of remember that China sees itself as the largest, and I would add the most powerful developing country in the world. And that's why for China, Africa remains a natural ally, in the sense that China's strategy, is aimed at uniting the South to weaken the North. And that's, I think today is pretty clear with the Xi Jinping's foreign policy priorities. And so Africa is important for China. There is one thing which is both I would say an asset and liability, is the fact that you have 54 nations in Africa. So it means you have a lot of nations who can vote with China in multilateral government organization like United Nations, and that's why Africa is so important. It's a liability because 54 nations mean 54 decision makers. It's a very scattered and divided continent. It's not that united, and a lot of differences among this country, differences in size, differences in culture, and so on and so forth. So that's people from the outside tend to put Africa in the same basket, but it's a very complex continent. And I can tell you, having been there for 12 years, or every year, I've seen a lot of diversity, I have to say. So the only country which still has relation with Taiwan, you may have never heard of, is Swaziland. We call it Eswatini. For how long, we don't know. And there is another place which is not a country, it's a de facto nation state, which is Somaliland, which split with Somalia in 30 years. Now you've got China has a number of well-known traditional partners, with which China developed privileged relations and the Mao. I listed some of them here: Egypt, Nigeria, Tanzania, and Zambia, Sudan, Zimbabwe, the Tazara being the symbol of that friendship. The railway between Dar es Salaam and Zambia. But China has invested in a number of new partners, which are more important, I would argue, for China today. South Africa, which is the only developed economy in Africa, and the major partner. part of the BRICS, as you know, that's called Nigeria, which is the other powerhouse of Africa in terms of, and its GDP now has clearly overtaken the South Africa GDP, so it's a major economy. And then Angola because of its oil, Ethiopia because it's a large important country, but also because Ethiopia is the seat of the African Union, the multilateral African organization, which is the most important organization in Africa. Now, the other thing which I've witnessed in doing fieldwork in Africa is that China has today, I have to say, the largest network of embassies in Africa. And China's embassies are pretty large. I've included in my presentation a few pictures you will see. It's amazing. China doesn't leave any stone unturned in Africa. It's amazing. Even the microstate. Have you heard of Sao Tome and Principe, 2 islands which were for Portuguese colonies? China has an embassy. There are just 12 embassies there. Seychelles the same, 12 embassy China is there. And in many of the Cape Verde, which is also a small place, China is there. And I have a picture of, I will show you a picture of yes, that's the Cape Verde, the Chinese embassy in Cape Verde and Praia, in capital city of Cape Verde, which is the largest by far. The largest, the Russian embassy next door is just twice smaller. So just to give you an idea of the network. And China cultivates also a relation with the African Union, which don't have relation with many countries as an organization. It has relation with the US, with the EU, but China is a major partner of the African Union. And there's been a lot of story about the construction of the new headquarters of the African Union in Addis Ababa because China paid for that construction. And there was a lot of story about possible drugs and spying devices in the building established by Africa, which have been reported by Le Monde, the French newspapers. The other thing which sort of underscores China's diplomatic activism in Africa is the fact that every year in January, the Chinese foreign minister goes to Africa and usually chooses a number of 4 to 5 countries, which are in the China's radar screen for particular reasons. And it's a mixture of large countries and small countries. This year, Qingong, the new foreign minister, as soon as he was appointed, he went to Africa, including he went to South Africa, in Congo, and Benin, which is a very small country, but which is, I think, an important partner as well in West Africa. Now, FOCAC, everybody knows about FOCAC. It means every 3 years, the latest meeting took place in Dakar, Senegal, and we will come back to that later. It's an important venue for reaching out to all African countries. Okay, so that's, well, by the way, that's to give you an illustration of what China has built in Africa. Then the seat of the National Assembly in the same country is Praia, Cape Verde, a small archipelago west of Senegal in the Atlantic Ocean. So that was built in the 1980s by China, and that was a donation, that was a grant. Well, that's another embassy. You wouldn't believe where it is. The largest is a very large Chinese embassy that's in a very new country, which is the South Sudan, Juba. And it's clearly, I mean, an American embassy is a small provisional building. All the Europeans are in the same compound, and the Chinese has its own large embassy, and it's amazing. That's taken, by the way, from a hotel which was also built by the Chinese, where you have a large swimming pool. So the best hotel in the city, Juba. Okay, now there's been a number of important changes. I think over the years, I think there are 2 periods of time, I would say, to summarize. A revival of China-Africa policy in the 1990s, in the mid-1990s. There was a moment of neglect, I would say, after the beginning of the reform era after 78, all the way to the end of the Cold War. There was no interest. Well, there was less interest. China's priority was to normalize with the West, to develop relations with America, with other developed countries, not much with Africa. So it's only one of the reasons was, of course, the competition with Taiwan, because Taiwan took advantage of that to normalize relations with a number of African countries, all the way from Burkina Faso, Niger, even Senegal at one point, 1996, by the way, normalized with Taiwan. So and that's why the wake-up call, I think, for Beijing said, well, now we have to invest much more in Africa. And that's how Jiang Zemin launched his policy, which is, and revived its Africa policy. And that was part of a larger strategy, which is called going out strategy, in Chinese, encouraging Chinese companies to invest outside of China. Until 2013, I mean, 2013 important turning point. I'm sure you know why it is a turning point, because that's the year Xi Jinping launched the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. At the time it was called OBOR, but the priority were before 2013 were clearly the very well-known traditional priority: trade, investment, of course, agricultural projects, funding for infrastructure, but also humanitarian aid, and some of the most traditional features of Chinese Africa, China's Africa policy is medical missions, all the way back to the 1960s. China has been one of the first countries really to openly declare that it will align with the UN Millennium Development Objectives, but also with the African Union 2063 objective. I think it's mentioned in another slide. So, what are China's major instruments of influence? One, of course, is to build infrastructure, and we'll come back to give you some examples later. But also to influence some regional organization and be part of like the ECOWAS, which is a regional organization, sub-regional organization in West Africa. China's offered to build its new headquarters in Juba, but also China participates in a number of financial organizations. I mentioned here other tools of influence are clearly there, and some of them have developed rather strongly in the 2010s. The number of scholarships, the Confucius Institute, but also the media activities. Xinhua selling a number of reports, or giving reports to a lot of press agencies in Africa. So that's a way of it. That's a kind of channel of influence for China. I would also mention very briefly party-to-party relations between the Chinese Communist Party and a number of African ruling parties, and sometimes opposition parties, if they have a chance of being part of the ruling coalition. And then finally, the other final dimension is the military and defense cooperation, which has been going on, which is not very strong, but which is there as a way to reaching out the military and defense establishments, number of capacity. I mentioned the first slide. Okay, that's me in N'Djamena, Chad, with a medical mission in 2016. Now, what is quite interesting, that was when I'm playing Chachi, but what is interesting is they had the slogan of the China Medical Team and the slogan by Xi Jinping. So even far, 10,000 kilometers away from Beijing, have a Xi Jinping Foundation. So that was in 2016 in N'Djamena. And well, that was in Mauritania, the French-speaking country. Last year, I think, yes, last year, 2022. So 50 years of medical cooperation. So since 2013, there's been clearly a deepening of the relationship, a more ambitious policy, and you can see more dimension here in this industrial investments. The idea would be to move production lines into Africa. I mentioned the African Union Agenda 63, 2053, but also an ambition to strengthen soft power tools, including scholarships, and the number of African. The Confucius Institute has also pretty much increased in the last 10 years to reach 62 institutes in 48 countries. In fact, the other important dimension has been the CGTN, the global television network, Chinese television network, which was set up in 2016 and which has also developed a lot of activities in the African. Something which is new for China is to become more active on the security front in different ways, announcing some contribution to the creation of the African Union Permanent Standby Force. That was an interesting announcement. But I think the most spectacular decision was to set up a naval base Djibouti in 2017. From an institutional point of view, there's been also some change in the way China operates, not only in Africa, but in the developing world, in establishing a new China International Development Corporation Agency, or CICA in English, which is, hard to compare it with other state agencies in charge of development assistance, like the AFD in France, the Agence Française de Développement, or the JICA in Japan. But the idea was to put under the same umbrella, same agency, all these development assistance activities and funding. We can come back in the Q&A, because there's still a lot of uncertainties about how much power this agency has today. It's directly under the Prime Minister, the State Council, but it's still very dependent, in one word, of the Ministry of Commerce, actually, which still control most of the money. Now, for China, Africa, if you look at the overall amount of foreign trade, and we'll give you a few details later, Africa is not that big. I looked at the figure in 2022. It's less than 5% of China's foreign trade. It's not meaningless, because 5% of Chinese foreign trade is a lot of money. It's 280-something billion US dollars, but out of 6 trillion, it's not really much. In terms of, and that's a big, important point to make here. In terms of FDI, foreign direct investments, it's also very small. China, pretty simply, the number of Chinese loans to for funding African projects is very high, but FDI's investment, strictly sensu, is rather small, so around 45 billion less. Where China has really made a difference is in funding a lot of infrastructure projects, and 30% of China's infrastructure projects overseas have been located in Africa. Now, one of the new priorities was the development of industrial parks. Some, I don't have much time to talk about them. Some have, to put it simply, some of them have been rather successful. But as I said, not much money has been invested in those parks. The idea was to open the park and to attract all the investment from other countries. The one in Addis Ababa works rather well. Accra in Ghana, Kampala in Uganda, Lagos and in Nigeria. But some have been rather empty or haven't taken off ground really, like the one in Egypt or the one in Djibouti, which when I did some fieldwork in 2018, it was still free. I've got some updated information about the one in Djibouti, which was pretty empty. So there is a lack of new investment in those industrial but clearly, with the FOCAC 2015, the new priority was there to sort of enhance African industrial capacity. There's been some success story, just to give an example. Some shoe industry, which have moved to Addis Ababa from China and other places in Asia. But those cases are not that big. So that's just a few illustration of the publicity for these industrial parks. The one in Kampala, in Uganda, you can see. But also, I wanted to give you an example of Chinese private entrepreneurs. I've met quite a number of them. They are quite courageous. I would say very adventurous. Some of them. He tried some fish business in Sudan, which didn't work too well, and then he moved to Jamaica, to Chad. Jamaica is north of Jamaica. Why did I pick up that example? Because he managed to open a company, a factory, manufacturing steel rods in that industrial park set up by China, and very close to a mini refinery also owned by CNPC north of Jamaica. So I think it was making money, but it was tough. Okay, now in the just a snapshot of some of the leaders' forecast, give you an idea whether China's priorities now. One is to help, because China now has a large surplus in Africa. In the 90s, we'll show you some statistics later. in the 1990s, 2000, China had a big deficit because China was importing a lot of raw materials from Africa, like I mentioned, oil, copper, and didn't export a lot of goods. Now it's it goes both ways a lot, and Africa buys a lot from China, both consumers products and products, but also industrial products, for its infrastructures and other needs. So that's the idea, was to help Africa exporting more products to China. There are some good examples. One is the cashew nuts. Have you heard of the cashew nuts? The best cashew nuts are manufactured in Guinea-Bissau, by the way, in West Africa. And there are a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs there who are busy trying to, because cashew nuts is a good market in China. I mean, look at the price of cashew nuts; it's pretty high. And then the best all come from Africa. Okay, that's what I. And then, yes, the latest FOCAC is also interesting. It gives you an idea of what are the new priorities. Is less infrastructure, clearly. And there are a number of factors to that. One is the debt issue, which I'm going to say a few words later. But also the need to now to move to other priorities like training people and also make the China's product more green. The problem with the BRI when it was announced, you remember 10 years ago, there was no green element in it. So they had to adapt that. And there was an announcement made by Xi Jinping, you remember, at the UN National Assembly, the UN General Assembly, saying in September 2021, China will stop funding coal-fired power plants. That doesn't mean that China stopped building coal-fired power plants in China itself, because it still needs to do that. It's still polluting a bit more the planet, but the outside of China stopped doing that. So, and that's what is important. Oh, now in terms of professional training, maybe you don't know what Bujumbura is, the capital city of Burundi. And it's a pretty ambitious building. The training is a technical school or vocational school. With training people, training skills, technicians. In a very poor country. So, China is there as well. And there is no other non-local training school in that country. Now, if we move to, yes, that's what I wanted to illustrate in terms of trade. You can see that the deficit was kind of getting bigger for China all the way to 2012, but that will be reversed very quickly later in the 2010s. And now, the interesting table here, because that's the figures prior to COVID, 2019, when there was already quite a bit of, the amount was over 200 billion US import and export. And I will come back to I have another slide with the ranks, let's say the major partners. But in terms of foreign direct investment, it's not that big. The stock, the flow is here, but the stock is just under 50 billion. So now, yes, here you've got the ranking. Clearly, and that's as I will show you. Maybe we can go to 2021 because the ranking to give you the latest ranking. Yes, it doesn't change that much. South Africa maybe still dominant. Remember 10 years ago it was more 55%, but it's still dominant because it's real with the yes, I've got a number of important. Now, yes, Nigeria second one, but China doesn't import much oil from Nigeria. Most of Nigeria oil is going to Europe or to America or not so much to China. It's more Angola. You can see China's import from Angola is very high because it's mainly made of oil. And then the other important country where China imports from is Congo-Kinshasa or the DR Congo. A lot of cobalt, a lot of copper, and that's why you have this. Congo-Brazzaville as well, and China imports quite a bit of oil. Now, the other thing is, if you look at exports, China exports a lot of consumers goods to countries which are very large, which have a large domestic market, like Nigeria. You can see 22 billion, or Egypt, which has a very large population, and you don't have enough, even on that. At least you don't have Ethiopia, which is much lower in terms of trade exchanges with China. Just to give you an example, and this hasn't changed. Oh yes, Algeria as well, of course, quite a bit. Now, where does China sit? I couldn't find it more recent data, but I have some, on about 2022. But it gives you an idea in terms of export. Where does China sit? It's only 8% of African export, and EU still remains a major importer of African goods. And also the major trade partner of Africa ahead of China. That was in 2020. But what is interesting, of course, is you see India, the United States, which are much behind, way behind for China, for imports. Now I have some figures for 2022. Yes, it's here. Gives you the latest figures that's published by China. And comparing to, China has caught up quite a bit with the EU now. It's 22% of African foreign trade is, well, that's what's 21 is with China, and only 23 with the EU, and the US is way behind. So clearly, that's the latest figures. So 282 billion. So it does recover a bit. Now, put things in perspective. China's Latin America foreign trade is over 300 billion, so much bigger. And with the Middle East is always bigger because of China's half of China's oil imports come from the Middle East. So it's in a way, the Middle East is more important for China today. So we've seen that with the recent mediation between Iran and Saudi Arabia, negotiated by China with some success, as you know. So here again, some data about FDI. Yes, let's go to the latest figure and stock and flow. Actually, the stock has decreased a bit with COVID, I guess. But South Africa is really the place where China's companies have invested the most still today. With now caught up with Kinshasa because of the industry I've just mentioned, cobalt, and copper and other industries and other big projects in Katanga, but other places where China have invested are listed here. So it's it's mainly countries where China has a strong relation, like Angola or Zambia. Look at the time. Okay. Now again, as this table shows you. I couldn't find the latest one, but where does Africa sit in China FDIs? It's less than 3% of China's FDI. Well, most of them, as you know, in the value of China's FDI, a lot of them are Hong Kong, in Hong Kong, and that's of course the twist a bit the result that China is Africa is way behind even Latin America, which is clearly a place where China has invested well in the last few years. Well, that's an old picture taken by. So some of the important Chinese companies are pretty active. I should have shown you a picture of Huawei, which is one of the most active and successful companies in Africa, building in telecom and telecommunication infrastructure there. But ZTE has also its own markets, particularly in one of the markets that is strong is Ethiopia. Now, that's where China really has made a difference. So my data are not very, are based on the usual well-known data sets, which are the Carry at Tsai run by Deborah Brockingham. But now part of the data, for the ones who are interested in those data, it goes beyond Africa, of course, moves to Boston University, where they have a big data set of Chinese loan, not only for loan to Africa, but also everywhere. China, development finance, and so on and so forth. So you clearly see here the major sectors where China has, I wouldn't say invested, but has left money, has funded projects, transports, including roads and railways, power station, mines, and telecom are the major. And the recipients, the top recipients are here. Angola is way ahead of other countries, but Ethiopia, and then those countries are the ones now which we need to manage their debt, not only with China, but among other countries. So Ethiopia, Zambia, Kenya, Egypt, Nigeria, so much. So that's the top 10. Now I mentioned here something which has been discussed over the years, which is less prominent now than before, the so-called Angola model, but you see it quite a lot still, which means that Chinese SOEs, mainly SOEs, they use Chinese workforce, Chinese loans from the so-called political banks, the two ones here, the Exim Bank and the China Development Bank. You can see the ratio, which have been the major funders of these infrastructure projects, ahead of the World Bank in the last 20 years, ahead of the World Bank, which is quite amazing. I mean, the figures are comparable, but it's yes, 160 according to the latest BU, Boston University data. So, and the Angola model is still there. And the idea is for countries which have it's work with countries with raw materials like oil and other raw materials. So that's how they pay back their loans. Now one of the benefits of Chinese projects is their speed. And when in the interview with local people and officials in Africa, they keep talking about the speed. It's reliable, and there are not so many checks and before starting the project. And then you still have added that even tongue in cheek. It's always on time before the next election, and that's important because that in some countries when you have elections, it's something which you can rely. I mean, they can promote as an achievement thanks to the China. So that's a list of kind of success achievement list, which was published by Wang Yi years ago now, and so he gives you that. So. And I can witness it. Now, there are a number of projects which have security and strategic implications. The port projects, clearly. Now, the US is very worried about those port projects. They say, China has the potential here to set up quite a number of naval bases, and if you control ports, you control the country's security and so on. So, but also airports, and I've seen quite a number of terminals. Now, these are projects quite interesting because some of them have to do with headquarters, military headquarters, but also ministerial, government buildings, and which include the telecommunication system. And of course, if Huawei set up the telecommunication system in a ministry or in a government building, you have always the suspicion that. Web or financing or for knowing more about what the country is. Okay, well, that's a picture of the Zimbabwe. Well, that's an interesting project. I went to Zimbabwe 2 years ago, and they were building free of charge a new seat of the parliament outside of Harare, 20 kilometers outside of Harare, and it's a donation, and so that's and now it's completed by. Another well-known project, which was old because I took a picture in Senegal in 2013, Grand Theatre in Dakar. Looks like it looks like the Great Hall of the People, kind of neo-Egyptian style. And that's a very interesting project because it's actually Solax. It's a subsidiary of CNPC in Niamey in Niger, and that's where they have they have both an hotel but also behind living quarters for all the Chinese technicians and engineers working on different projects, including on the refinery, which is far away. Well, and finally, that's a new airport. I was in Lomé in Togo, built by China. So just an example of the style of the airport. It's like any Chinese airports in China itself. And then finally, Monrovia. I was struck. I mean, that's a new park in Liberia in 2019. Another one built by China. So we can pretty modern. Okay, now I'm going to go through this assistant project quite quickly because that's what I would like to say here is that actually China's assistance to the South is not that big. I mean, you can look at the slides later if you want to look at the background. 40 billion from 49 to 2009, and then it's been increased to 42 billion over 5 years. on average, China, in terms of development assistance, just disburses 7 billion a year, which is way behind OECD countries. I mean, I've listed the latest in 2020 data. It's, France 14, Germany 29, and the US, and that's public money. And US they have also a lot of private money. So it's not that much. So China also, well, has tried to promote tripartite cooperation, but in the current environment, which is with the word about at the end, it's getting harder and harder for the tension between China and the West. One thing I wanted to say here is, yes, how is it? I mean, this assistance is divided clearly half in grants and half in concessional loans, and very small portion what is called interest-free loans. Now, the interest-free loans are really dedicated to very small projects, SMEs projects usually. So, and that's where, I mean, when we talk about debt relief or forgiveness, very often it's about interest-free loans. So it's not that much money actually. It's from a symbolic point of view, it has it's important, but it's not that important. So that's it. But Africa is clearly still, gets a half or nearly half. That has been pretty steady actually in terms of ratio between the, in terms of distribution of China's foreign aid by region. Well, just an example. Well, China has its own logo. The logo, I mean, and it's in Portuguese because that's why it's in Cape Verde. China Aid actually, and China Aid, the logo itself reminds me of USAID. I mean, they want to use that. Before, China didn't like to use the term aid, but now they use it everywhere, including that's what in aid de la Chine gets in French here. That's what it's in Congo, Brazzaville, in the I'm gonna pass on that because it's I'm already late. I'll tell you that debt relief. Well, the debt issue is complicated. If you want to know more about the debt issue, you can read Deborah Brottingham. She has done a lot of good work on it. What I would say, China is not the only creditor, far from it, but some countries are more exposed to China debt than others. And I've listed the ones who are the most exposed to China debt: Zambia, Djibouti, which is a small place, but still, Brazzaville, Congo Brazzaville are the most exposed. And Zambia is big, discussion about now. Now the China's, Chinese debt falls in a number of categories, including the DSSI 1 and the debt cancellation program and the FOCAC, and also ad hoc debt relief, which China has announced from time to time, and also the IMF, which the IMF release trust. Okay. On that, yes, I mentioned a few. There are a number of issues here. You can see, first of all, I would say that China prefers to reschedule debt than to grant debt forgiveness. There's been a number of cancellation, as I said, but only very small amounts, very symbolic amount, 124. Debt are in billion, and we talk about in million. Debt cancellation in billions, so which are interesting gestures, but which are not going to change really the equation. There is a big dispute. I mean, the case of Sri Lanka is interesting because Sri Lanka, last week actually, the IMF and China reached a deal to sort of disburse nearly $3 billion US to Sri Lanka, and the question is whether there's going to be a model, a precedent for other cases like Zambia, which is the next case, which is not yet solved. So that's where the BU data, which is quite interesting. It shows you how much we are in the dark actually, but because China has announced the waiving the 23 interest-free loans, which are small ones, with maturity by the end of it, to 70 unspecified African countries. So yeah, and then there's been some calculation made by the BU people at Boston University, and and the variation. I mean, the estimation can vary quite a lot, but still, it's very small portion. That's what I wanted to say on that. Okay, a few words about the Chinese in Africa. There's been a lot. I mean, by itself, it could be a subject of a thesis. I mean, what is his name? Howard French wrote a book about that a few years ago. I think the official number, 1 million is not the case anymore. Officially, 400,000 Chinese are in Africa now, residing there. including quite a number of contractor workers. But the number of contractor workers has dropped quite a lot, partly because of COVID, but also partly because of the reduction of infrastructure projects in the last few years in that. So now it's, the official figure in 2020 was 100,000 contractor workers. And those contractor workers are not going to stay there. Some of them will stay behind, because they feel, Africa, Zambia, for instance, is a good place. They can buy land and start a, farm, whatever. But most of them will go back. They work hard there, they save money and start a business back in China. Now, I've tried to sort of divide the Chinese national in different categories: the private businesses, the bureaucratic code, some adventurers, some mafia people. A lot of, it's kind of a new frontier for a lot of, not only African, but also other countries. So, okay. Now, one of the issues, of course, attached to that is that there are new security risks, which was, and China has tried to improve its consular protection to Chinese nationals. The evacuation of, 30,000 nationals from Libya was a wake-up call. And if you haven't seen the movie, have you seen this movie? One Equate. Have you seen that? It's about, well, by the way, they don't use force, they use diplomatic power, I would say, to evacuate Chinese nationals from a country which looks very much like, it's called Numea, but it looks very much like Libya. So you haven't seen it, you can see it. Very interesting. So it tells you what China wants to do in Africa in terms of consular protection and national protections outside of China. It was just an example of in Cameroon of amicale that you can see between China and Cameroon. Also Chinese casino in Zambia. Well, that's okay. A few words about security, because there's been a lot of hype on that, but I think we have to put things in perspective. China is not a major supplier of weapons and military equipment to Africa. China gives a few things, but it's very symbolic, just to poor countries. But the major suppliers remain Russia, the US, Germany, and France, ahead of China. So you got some CEFC data here. What is more meaningful, I would say, are two things. Of course, China's participation in the transparency operation, which was one of the drivers of the opening of a naval base in Djibouti in 2017 at the start. And then China's more active participation in UN peacekeeping operations in Africa and elsewhere. But Africa is where most of the Chinese peacekeepers are deployed, in particular in South Sudan and Mali. And okay, well, that's the Djibouti base. Well, those pictures are well known. There's been some training in the desert, but we haven't seen many reports on them lately. So just an example of, I had a chance to visit the peacekeepers in Juba in South Sudan. Again, that you wouldn't guess it's in South Sudan, but that's the name. And I have a picture with one of the instructors here. That was in 2021. Okay, now finally a few words about education and cultural cooperation. I think the number of scholarships has increased quite a lot, and there is a relationship between offering scholarship and the Confucius Institute, because the good students of the Confucius Institute will get a scholarship if they complete a 3-year program there. It's very cheap. It's nearly, it's not gratis, but it's very cheap. And it's a way for China to expand its influence. But I wouldn't be too worried about those Confucius Institutes, in a sense, because, well, basically, it's a language training. There are language training centers. Of course, they convey information. They sort of disseminate information, kind of official information about China. But what is interesting are the young people working in the Confucius Institute. The Chinese volunteers, who are young people, who want to have any experience outside of China, and they're very independent-minded. So some of them are not. Of course, the director will toe the line. I think the director he or she will be a party member, but the rest of the staff is pretty open, so I wouldn't be too worried about the impact of those confusions. And by the way, just final thing about China language training. Chinese are very the number of students has increased, but it's not that much, and the number is not that. And language, and China remains a very difficult language. So you have more Africans who can speak pretty good Chinese, but the number of their number is pretty small. The major driver, of course, is to become a trade person, to trade with China, to become a merchant or businessman or business person, but only a few of them will achieve that. Okay, that's a few. Well, that with Alistair Cole, the current head of the GIS department, Alistair Cole. Have you met him? Yes, he's that. And that was in Comoros with the director of and that was in the Central African Republic with the whole team. And then she was very nice, the director, yes, and one of the volunteers. And then we went out all together. It was quite nice, and they were nice people, and with local people as well. Finally, I mean, that's one of the footprints of China in Africa. It funded a whole brand new university in Cape Verde in Praia, which opened last year. And that was in 2021. It's a very ambitious, oversized project in the sense for Cape Verde, which is a very small country. And finally, I met some students studying Arabic in Khartoum, Sudan, which is a good place to study the language because it's safer and cheaper than Egypt. And they were, I think, all Han people, by the way. They were not Uyghur. Finally, party-to-party exchanges. That's another important dimension to reach out the elites. And I wrote a piece in a chapter in the book on that not long ago. It's fascinating. Well, the latest development is this construction of a new leadership school in Kibaha, which is outside of Dar es Salaam. One of my students from Tanzania has tried to get in. It's impossible. It's Fort Knox. He wasn't able to get in and get information but they're training quite a number of African parties officials. So that's, I think, a more meaningful tool of influence. And China has the Communist Party. China has a strong relation with a number of parties which operate. Sometimes is a kind of one-party system. Sometimes is a multi-party system. But those parties are all ruling parties: the ANC, the Prosperity Party in Ethiopia, the CCM in Tanzania, and pretty much so. FLN is in Algeria, which is a de facto party state. So that's quite interesting way of reaching out the elites and sometimes capturing the elites in Africa. Now, China's image finally is good, but it's not the only country which has a good image. Africa Barometer will tell you. I mean, I haven't got any more recent figure, but tell you, yes, China's image is pretty strong, but the US image remains pretty good as well. It's more the former colonizers, which are less, or even Russia's image has remained, on average, less lower than China's image. Now, as a result of China's activism, and that's one of the illustration of my point, which is China's new hegemony. And you see a number of African countries converging with China on a number of issues, which, of course, on which China is very sensitive. Hong Kong national security law, the policy in Xinjiang, or even the war in Ukraine, which is another interesting case study for try to measure how the African countries vote now. You can see the list of them, and I will just summarize in here. Yes, how I would qualify those convergences. I would still believe that China's soft power in Africa, it's much more based on economic clout, diplomatic activism, rather than ideological, even cultural attraction, which is more debatable question. Now, China's solution, or China model, because Qin Gong has talked about China model, is much more understood as a shortcut to modernization than as an alternative one-party political system. And by the way, Qin Gong, when he mentioned the China model, he didn't define it. He didn't say what it is. Is it the one-party system? It's not. I think it's a modernization model in which the state, the government plays a key role. That's the way I would summarize it. Now, there are different types of convergences. I think there are some authoritarian convergences. I studied the case of Ethiopia some time ago, but I was in Algeria last summer, and you could see that as well, or Zimbabwe, or even Egypt with HKUST. But a lot of, the more countries in Africa will converge with China in terms of, because they are non-aligned countries. The non-alignment is a very good card that China can play, because China can say we're not aligned either, and that goes back to the Bandung spirit and Bandung conference in the 50s. But that's something which is pretty, which has a lot of attraction in China, in Africa. And then finally, I think something we have to bear in mind is some countries in Africa have been just bought by China. I mean, why did they? And I know how it works, because I know that before a vote takes place in the UN, some countries, some Chinese diplomats will go to the government and say, if you want, we're going to finish that project, we can fund this project if you vote. And we do the same. And I know the French diplomat, they go, well, the French diplomat, they can't offer money. France is running out of money, but I know the French diplomat also are trying to influence votes in Africa and going to the foreign ministry. I hope you're going to vote with us on that issue. So that's something which all diplomats can do. Okay, and finally, I think we have to bear in mind that if you go to Africa, the dominant ideologies is more, liberal ideology, democracy. Christianity is very important, and Islam as well is very important. And those sets of beliefs clash with the one-party system, the way China's study to ideology. All right. Sorry, I've been a bit too long, but a few words of conclusion. Okay, I think it's fair to say that China is now a key diplomatic partner of Africa and economic partner. And I think it's, again, I would say at the beginning, but I would insist on the fact that Africa for China is part of a strategy aimed at winning the global south to encircle, a bit like Mao encircling cities, encircle and weaken the global north, the west. I haven't mentioned COVID-19, didn't have much time. I would say the impact of COVID-19 has been mixed. I mean, China's contribution has been well received. At the same time, the vaccine were not always free and they were not always used. There was some suspicion about the Chinese vaccine being not efficient. I mean, the perception was not always positive. And then you had the story of some African people being discriminated against in Guangzhou, which was it was not a big story in the world. It was a big story in some African country like Nigeria. It became, and it led to some kind of diplomatic crisis, which had to be managed. Now, as far as the BRI is concerned, we know that it's been a scale down, but still, I think it will continue. Because it's a pet project of seeding figures, there is no reason for putting an end to it. I don't think there is any debt trap the way, but the debt issue and the also has also related the kind of dependence upon China, what we call asymmetrical dependence on China, which gives China more leverage to influence its country. Yes, but it's far from being there's been all debate now is a bit outdated. Just wanted to flag it here. It's far from being a neo-colonial power, because I don't think that China wants to take too many responsibilities in Africa. Even if China has become one of the issues debated when you have elections in African countries. Now, there's been some pushback, and first of all, I would say that there are other emerging economies which are quite active, and I've seen them more active now in Africa. We just take the example of Turkey, which is very interesting. Because it's in the last 10 years, with Erdogan, they've developed a real African policy, but also some pushback from the West, as you know. I mean, with this new global gateway from the group of 7, pledging $300 billion for private funds to fund infrastructure in the world, particularly in Africa. And the Biden administration led a summit, which took place in December last year. So, and pledged also additional money to Africa. Now, what Africa is interesting, we'll finish on that. I think it's just, well, I can see, I mean, maybe things will change, but I predict they will try very hard to stay away from the Sino-US tensions and remain non-aligned. Some have moved close to Russia, as you know, in the last few months or years. Mali, Central African Republic, Burkina Faso, particularly to the regime of France, but that's a particular issue. And China overall is taking advantage of these moves, but it's not, it's not part of it. But I think most African countries would start to keep a balance between its their major partners. So China's new hegemony in Africa doesn't mean that China is the only game in town. in the continent. That's my okay, that's all for today. So all right, so that okay, now thank you for your attention, and should I stop sharing maybe?
Yeah, I guess you can stop sharing, and then if people want to ask
Okay.
questions, maybe do you want to see if anyone online has questions first?
All right, so the chat box for the time being is empty. So
Or people maybe ask them if they want to raise their hands.
all right, so please raise your hand if you want to ask a question, or write in the chat box your question.
While we're waiting for online participants to formulate their countries, their questions. Their questions. I just want to express admiration for the richness and nuance nature of your presentation. It's just amazing how much work you've done on these topics. And I'm curious, how many African countries have you done field work in?
Quite a number of them, I think 40 countries.
Oh my
Altogether,
gosh.
I've been everywhere in Africa to sort of answer more rather your question. Everywhere except 2 countries, which is very hard to go now. Libya is one of them, because of the civil war which is going on. You know, you can go to Tripoli, but it's not that useful. And the other country where it's very hard, for which it's very hard to get a visa, is Eritrea, which is a very close authoritarian place. I've tried, but I've been so far unsuccessful. But I've been everywhere apart from that. So yes, not everywhere for this field work, but I was, you know, I traveled to Africa earlier. But yes, I have. But things change quite quickly, so I have to go back. And for instance, I went back to Addis Ababa. I did my first field work in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia in 2011, very beginning when I got my first GRF. And I went back 2 years ago, yes, in summer 2021. I was amazed how Addis had changed. Number of skyscrapers, the new metro, MTR. It's so there's been a lot of changes, but of course, the context has changed as well, because you had at the time you had still the civil war with Tigray, and also things have changed quite a bit. So you have to go back quite often to see how things evolve. So, yes, but it's good to compare the different countries, and you see the same patterns everywhere. And same feature of Chinese activism or presence everywhere. It's more or less the same actually. So you see the big players, the SOEs, the oil companies, the construction company, China Harbor. The names which come back, or the CCCC, the construction company, what they build roads. And so, yes, I didn't mention in my presentation the 2 major, they are well-known railways projects. Which was started before the BRI. They put back in the BRI later, but the Djibouti Addis Ababa railway, and then the Mombasa Nairobi railway were actually decided. The project were decided before the BRI was launched in the early 2010, 2011. Let's see if any question on yours?
Well, I have another question.
Yeah, please do.
There's been a lot of discussion about China's BRI investments, and also selling an installation of smart city projects around the world as exporting authoritarianism. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are about that interpretation of Chinese digital exports.
Okay, well, yeah. I think China is very, again, with the term agnostic. So if China works with an authoritarian country which wants to, set up smart city systems to improve its surveillance of the population, China will provide all the help and the necessary technical, features to achieve that goal. In other countries, China, if some countries want to get China's expertise or assistance for developing smart cities, but at the same time trying to protect privacy, China will adjust. And now it doesn't mean that China doesn't use some of its project to get access to information. That's, I mentioned the headquarters of the African Union, and that was, well, I think the Le Monde reporter was spot on. I mean, he had good sources. Now, what does it mean? The same can be applied to some government project. When China refurbished the headquarters of the Niger armed forces and provide all the telecom system, of course, I mean, we can use that to get access to information. Is it useful? Is it meaningful? I don't know. But for answer, to answer your question more broadly, I think I would be cautious. It depends very much on the country. So that's why I'm inclined to talk about authoritarian convergences, because when you have two authoritarian systems or countries or governments which want to cooperate, of course they will converge and they will have find some common ground to work on projects. But China would not like to limit itself to authoritarian countries. In Africa, actually, a lot of African countries are democracies, or what we call in French démocrature. It's a mixture of dictatorship and democracy, because some leaders have stayed in power too long. In the case of Cameroon with Biya, the case of Congo Brazzaville with Sassou Nguesso, and so on and so forth. I mean, a lot of cases where for actually former French colony, which are not real democracies, but the aspiration for democracy and multi-party system is very strong. And I don't think that China is going to change that. We had discussion with China about Africa, Chinese experts. Sometimes they have a wrong belief or wrong perception of the African countries' priorities, and particularly the African countries' civil society, which are still very attached to freedom. Okay, there's a question and democracy of this. So after the mediation, yes. Which one? Okay, Frédéric Lemaitre. We can't hear you. Well, it depends on which country you have in mind. If it's Mali or Burkina Faso, it's going to be hard, I think. There's one example I can give, because it is Frédéric Lemaitre. Anyway, there's one example I can give, which is Ethiopia and the rebels in Tigray. China has tried to play a role, a bit like I would say the US. Whether it has been successful, we don't know actually. We know that there's been some negotiation between the government in Addis Ababa and the rebels in the north of the country. There's some kind of so it may have helped, but we don't know exactly whether it has, its role has been meaningful, because there's been other players. And don't forget, in Ethiopia, the US is still also pretty active. One example, is the way, I'm sure you've heard of Ethiopian Airlines. Ethiopian Airlines took off ground, with the help of the United States. It's a major airline in Africa, and linking up Africa with Asia. We have direct flights on Ethiopia and all the way to Hong Kong, but also China. There are 4 destinations in China: Hangzhou, Beijing, Guangzhou, and somewhere else, Chengdu. And and that with the help of the US. So the US is also pretty influential there. So, yeah, we haven't seen any other success story. So the big question is moving out of the subject is with whether China will play a role in negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. I mean, there is this ambition. Whether it's going to be successful, I don't have some plans. So anyway, that's it. Did that? Yes. Okay, you say yes, but okay, can we? It's muted. Are they muted?
Well, they can. I think they can unmute themselves if they want to.
Yes. Let's see. Oh.
Yes.
All right.
Okay. See if there are any other questions.
I have a question. Like you mentioned the Angola model,
Yes.
but why Angola? Like it's based on the fact that
Yes.
there is a relationship based on raw material. But
Yes, oil.
Lots of other countries also have this raw material. Why did it start with Angola? Is it because it's specifically oil, or is there any particular relationships previously that can explain this country as being?
I think when we use the term Angola model, it's good because I don't know actually. I've read that everywhere, and I think it's the relationship with Angola, which is an issue in a way, because if you go back in the civil war in Angola in the 70s, actually China was on the wrong side of history. China was supporting the two liberation movements which are opposed to the MPLA, which is the one in power now, the FNLA and the UNITA with Savimbi, supported by South Africa, by the West, by the American. So it's only in the 80s actually that China normalized with Angola with the MPLA, which is still in power today. And with the end of the civil war in 1991, that things have. It's only in the 90s that China started to really get interested in Angola oil, and for a very good reason that China in 1993, as you know, became a net importer of oil. It's only in 93, so that's since 93, and China felt that it needed to, and that was a good place to test that model, which is you have a lot of oil, we're going to import that oil, we're going to help you, and developing infrastructure. And China built a lot of projects in Angola, so many that actually oil has not been enough to pay back those projects. So that's why Angola is in the red now with a very, very, very important debt to China. But I think that's how it started. When I went in Angola, it was trying to remember 2014, some time ago. I've been back, I have to say. But 2014, there were a lot of Chinese there. They were doing everything. It's amazing, and the Angola relied on them to even to manage hotels. I mean, this was made. They had, and the rumor was there were maybe 400,000 Chinese in Angola. I think it was wrong, but that was a perception. I think it was more, but the diplomatic community will tell you maybe there are 400,000 Chinese working in Angola. I know there were a lot of them, maybe 200,000, let's say, in many different places. In every city I went to, a place inland called Malange, which was farming, kind of rural area, but they were. The hotel estate was managed by Chinese, and all the side were Chinese. And you had a Chinese workshop on the other side of the road. I mean, they were doing everything. And the other thing was that attracted a lot of mafia, to the point, and prostitutes, gambling den, and so on, to the point that that was in public because it was in 2016 or maybe earlier. There was a big operation organized together by the Angolan police, together with the Chinese public security, to deport all these guys. They were sent back to China. 200 or 400 people were sent back to China. They were all crooks, and that because again, Africa is a new frontier which has attracted a lot of people. First of all, some business people, we want to start again their business from scratch. With good reason for leaving China, to be forgotten for a while. So these guys, they don't interact with the embassy. They stay far away from the Chinese embassies. And then this mafia in Guinea, Conakry, that was amazing. You had a restaurant with karaoke, and people, what the karaoke is in China. It's not like it's in China. Anyway, so, and you had these, another area, these gold miners in northern Ghana, all coming from Guangxi, because in Guangxi you had gold mines, extinct gold mines, but with this expertise. So people they brought the expertise, the machinery, and so on, and actually they work on gold mine in northern Ghana, which had been subcontracted to them by Ghanaian gold miners. They didn't want to do that work themselves. So there was a kind of cooperation between the local gold miners and the Chinese technicians there to exploit the gold. And then all of a sudden, the government in Accra decided to get rid of them. So it's becoming a mess. I mean, there were a lot of complaints, and so they decided to deport all these guys from Ghana. And those Chinese people working in northern Ghana called the Chinese embassy, asking for help. And the Chinese would say, how can we help you? You're illegal here. So that's how, this idea of developing some kind of consular protection started, because, but you're not on the paper. I don't think Chinese. No, I don't think they're forced. They're not compelled to register with the embassy. But of course, if you register with the embassy, it gives you protection. Of course, some kind of control over what you're doing. But that's the best. I mean, if you want to renew your passport, you better register with the embassy. So most people, most private entrepreneurs, they have their own association, Chinese association, and they register with the embassy, and they're pretty closely connected. For security reasons, Chinese people are security, they're obsessed everywhere, and sometimes for good reason, because in some countries you are the only one carrying cash. So if they carry cash on the street, you have to be careful. And sometimes they single out, and there's stories in Tanzania, and also have Chinese people being attacked because they carry cash in the street, and they know pretty well, a bit like the Chinese tourists in Paris, pickpocketing the metro because they know they carry cash. So yes, so you have all sort of people there. So there was.
Just to see if there's anyone else on online or in the room that has a
Oh yes,
question.
there's another one.
Oh, yes, look at that.
Yes, like now, yes. Well, yes. I don't think they work. Yes, that's a good question. It's Frederic Lemaitre. I think that's him. Huh? It's Frederic.
Yes.
This is my friend in Beijing. That's the French, the Monde correspondent in Beijing. Frederic Lemaitre.
Oh,
Yes. No, he's a nice,
nice.
very good friend. Now, I was last summer in the Central African Republic, and what I can tell you, there's a kind of division of labor between the Chinese and the Russians, because the Russians control a number of gold mines there. Well, not so much diamonds, more controlled by the government, the Central African government. But some Chinese are also exploiting gold mines, and so the Wagner groups and the Russian provide protection to the Chinese in some places. But I have to say we have very little information about it. In Mali, it's more complicated because Mali, you have the MINUSMA, the peacekeeping forces from the UN, which is, I don't know how long it's going to stay there, but for the time being, the French have left, and the Barkhane and the French military have left. But you have the MINUSMA and the Wagner groups. And Chinese, they're not involved in security. In the MINUSMA, they're just 300 Chinese peacekeepers. So it's and they're all in Gao, in northwest sorry, northeast of Mali. So they're not doing the same thing. They are in good terms, I have to say, but with the Wagner group, it's more obscure. And yes, it's well, there are only 3 countries for the time being where the Wagner groups are active: is Mali, Burkina Faso, and the Central African Republic. Now, Central African Republic is have too many people with weapons. That's the issue. It's not very safe, I have to say. It's a bit problematic, but people, I mean, to put it simply, Chinese companies in Africa to make money. Private entrepreneurs, of course, they are there to make money. You have a lot of shopkeepers, and then the big companies are there to develop projects, and then those countries are no exception. So I think China is more cautious, but adopting more wait and see attitude vis-a-vis the new authorities in Bamako, for instance, in Mali. It's a complicated situation. So, and they prefer not to take too many risks. So the cooperation is on the ground. It's not a government to government. It's already 12.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, is that okay?
I said have guests tuning in from Beijing, and
Yes, that's good.
have a number of graduate students that were online. I think some of them had to go off to class. Pierre is with us online.
Kind of.
Any
Feel
question,
better,
Pierre?
Anyway, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. I want to dig through your CV and read a number of things that that you've alluded to, because you're clearly an expert on this, and I'm excited to
Thank you.
learn so much from you today. Thank you.
Thank you.